The cultural impact of the Beatles includes many effects on popular music and fashion. After the group was subject to Beatlemania, the continued commercial and critical success assisted many cultural movements, including a shift from American artists' global dominance of rock and roll to British acts, the proliferation of young musicians in the 1960s who formed new bands, the album as the dominant form of record consumption over singles, the term Beatlesque used to describe similar-sounding artists, and several fashion trends. In 1999, the Beatles were collectively included in Time magazine's compilation of the 20th century's 100 most influential people. As of 2009, they are the best-selling band in history, with estimated sales of over 600 million records worldwide. As of 2015, they hold the record for most number-one hits on the Hot 100 chart with 20. The Beatles have had myriad cover versions from a variety of artists. While "Yesterday" is one of the most covered songs in the history of recorded music. Overview. Writing for AllMusic, music critic Richie Unterberger recognizes the Beatles as both the greatest and most influential act of the rock era, and a group that introduced more innovations into popular music than any other rock band of the 20th century. In Rolling Stone magazine's Encyclopedia of Rock and Amp Roll, the editors define the band's influence as follows: the impact of the Beatles, not only on rock and amp roll but on all of Western culture, is simply incalculable. As personalities, they defined and incarnated 60s style: smart, idealistic, playful, irreverent, eclectic. Although many of the sales and attendance records have since been surpassed, no group has so radically transformed the sound and significance of rock and amp roll. Proved that rock and amp roll could embrace a limitless variety of harmonies, structures, and sounds. Virtually every rock experiment has some precedent on Beatles record. While the Beatles are often credited for sparking a musical revolution, research conducted by the Queen Mary University of London and Imperial College London suggests that the changes sparked by the band were already developing long before they set foot on American soil. Professor Armand Lero argues that their innovations have been overstated by music historians. They didn't make a revolution or spark a revolution, they joined one. The trend is already emerging and they rode that wave, which accounts for their incredible success. The United States was already becoming rockier and more energetic, and moving away from mellow sounds like doo-wop. You can already see that by the beginning of the 1960s. Before the Beatles reached America, bands like the Beach Boys and the Top Notes were already in record charts with Surfin' USA and Twist and Shout respectively. McCartney is quoted before the Beatles left for the United States in 1964, "They've got their own groups. What are we going to give them that they don't already have?" Beatles biographer Mark Lewison disagreed with the research by Queen Mary University, saying it stack up. Speak to anyone who was a young person in the US when the Beatles arrived and they will tell you how much of a revolution it was. They were there and they will tell you that the Beatles revolutionized everything. Author Bill Martin responds to oft-repeated criticisms that say the Beatles never did anything that was truly new. Rock music is synthesis and transmutation. What was original about the Beatles is that they synthesized and transmuted more or less everything. They did this in a way that reflected the time. They reflected the time in a way that spoke to a great part of humanity. And they did all of this really, really well. Winterberg adds, they were among the few artists of any discipline that were simultaneously the best at what they did and the most popular at what they did. Relentlessly imaginative and experimental, the Beatles grabbed hold of the international mass consciousness in 1964 and never let go for the next 6 years, always staying ahead of the pack in terms of creativity but never losing their ability to communicate their increasingly sophisticated ideas to a mass audience. The supremacy as rock icons remains unchallenged to this day, decades after the breakup in 1970. Beatlemania, influence on music, recording and songcraft. Rolling Stone editors elaborated, one of the first rock groups to write most of its own material, they inaugurated the era of self-contained bands and forever centralized pop. The music, from the not-so-simple love songs they started with to the later perfectionist studio extravaganzas, set new standards for both commercial and artistic success in pop album format. The dominance of the single as the primary medium of music sales changed with the release of several iconic concept albums in the 1960s, such as A Christmas Gift for You from Phil Spector, The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, The Mothers of Invention's Freak Out, and the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In January 1966, Billboard magazine cited the initial U.S. sales of the Beatles' Rubber Soul as evidence of teenage record bias increasingly moving towards the LP format. According to author David N. Howard, the standard of the all-original compositions on Rubber Soul was also responsible for a shift in focus from singles to creating albums without the usual filler tracks. Use of 12-string. George Harrison was the first person to own a Rickenbacker 360 12ths, a guitar with 12 strings, the low 8 of which are tuned in pairs, 1 octave apart, the higher 4 being pairs tuned in unison. The Rickenbacker is unique among 12-string guitars in having the lower octave string of each of the first 4 pairs placed above the higher tuned string. This, and the naturally rich harmonics produced by a 12-string guitar, provided the distinctive overtones found on many of the Beatles' recordings. His use of this guitar during the recording of A Hard Day's Night helped to popularize the model, and the jangly sound became so prominent that Melody Maker termed it the Beatles' secret weapon. Genres and movements. British invasion beat groups and garage bands. The Beatles' impact on the US was particularly strong, where a garage rock phenomenon had already begun, with hits such as Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, but was about to receive a major lift. On the 9th of February 1964, during the first visit to the United States, the Beatles made a historic appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, watched by a record-breaking viewing audience of a nation mourning the recent death of President John F. Kennedy. Bill Dean writes, "It's impossible to say just how many of America's young people began playing guitars and forming bands in the wake of the Beatles' appearance on The Sullivan Show, but the anecdotal evidence suggests thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or even more, young musicians across the country formed bands and proceeded to play." Tom Petty, who played in 2 garage bands in Gainesville, Florida during the 1960s, is quoted mentioning the Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show and how it influenced him to be in a band. According to him, within weeks of that, you could drive through literally any neighborhood in Gainesville and you would hear the strains of garage bands playing. I mean everywhere. And I'd say by a year from that time, Gainesville probably had 50 bands. For many, particularly young baby boomers. The Beatles' visit reignited the sense of excitement and possibility that had been momentarily taken by Kennedy's assassination. Much of this new excitement would be expressed in music, sometimes much to the chagrin of parents and elders, as kids raced to start bands by thousands, and this proliferation of new groups was not limited to the United States. Group sounds, psychedelic music. The Beatles, along with the Beach Boys, were the only acts to have high-charting psychedelic rock songs at the end of 1967. Raga rock and Indian rock. Although the Kinks, the Yardbirds and the Beatles themselves had incorporated droning guitars to mimic the qualities of the sitar, Norwegian wood is generally credited as sparking a musical craze for the sound of the instrument in the mid-1960s, a trend which would later be associated with the growth of Raga rock, Indian rock, and the essence of psychedelic rock, progressive rock and art rock. Power pop live concerts. The Beatles were the first entertainment act to stage a large stadium concert at Shea Stadium in New York City on Sunday, the 15th of August 1965. The group opened the 1965 North American tour to a record audience of 55,600. The event sold out in 17 minutes. It was the first concert to be held at a major outdoor stadium and set records for attendance and revenue generation, demonstrating that outdoor concerts on a large scale could be successful and profitable. The Beatles returned to Shea for a highly successful encore in August 1966. Beatlesque, Beatlesque, is a loose term which refers to music which sounds like the Beatles. It is widely used to an inconsistent degree, as the Toronto Star notes. Notion of that sound includes everyone from Panic at the Disco to Billy Joel to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. With those reference points, it's debatable whether the Beatles themselves would qualify for the adjective the music has spawned. Quote, after consulting radio producer Kevin Howlett, music professor Rob Bowman, and Klaatu drummer Terry Draper for the true meaning of the word, the three formed 8 potential answers. Penny Lane inspired piano, the big ending, bluegrass-influenced harmonies, I Am the Walrus inspired cellos, the stylistic contrast between Lennon and McCartney, the left-handed, right-handed drumming, the listener's perception, or a simulacrum of the Beatles' reputed sound that ultimately means nothing. Associated artists Badfinger, Electric Light Orchestra, Klaatu, Oasis, influence on fashions. Haircut. The Beatle haircut, also known as the mop top because of its resemblance to a mop or Arthur among fans, is a mid-length hairstyle named after and popularized by the Beatles, and widely mocked by many adults. It is a straight cut, collar length at the back and over the ears at the sides with a straight fringe. Because of the immense popularity of the Beatles, the haircut was widely imitated worldwide between 1964 and 1966. The hairstyle led toy manufacturers to begin producing real hair and plastic. Beatle wigs. Lowell Toy Manufacturing Corp. of New York was licensed to make the only authentic Beatle wig. There have been many attempts at counterfeiting, but in its original packaging this wig has become highly collectible. Mikhail Safonov wrote in 2003 that in the Brezhnev-dominated Soviet Union, mimicking the Beatles' hairstyle was seen as highly rebellious. Young people were called hairies by their elders, and were arrested and forced to have the hair cut in police stations. Beatle Boots. Beatle boots are tight-fitting, Cuban-heeled, ankle-length boots with a pointed toe. They originated in 1963 when Brian Epstein discovered Chelsea boots while browsing in the London footwear company Anello and Amp Davide. He consequently commissioned 4 pairs for the Beatles to complement the new suit image upon the return from Hamburg, who wore them under drain-pipe trousers. In popular culture cover versions in May 1966, John Lennon said of people covering the songs, "Lack of feeling in an emotional sense is responsible for the way some singers do our songs. They don't understand and are too old to grasp the feeling." Beatles are really the only people who can play Beatle music. Bibliography